Hi, welcome to the 2022 Hearst Lecture. We are so honored to have Matt Murray, Editor-in-Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Now, Matt started working at the Journal in 1994 in the Pittsburgh Bureau. And I've known people who've worked in Austin Bureau and in the Houston Bureau. So he started in Pittsburgh, and then you went to New York to cover banking?
Yes, I did.
So he's been at the Journal for 28 years. He did the math for us, and he is editor-in-chief since 2018, correct?
That's right.
So you took that job, and in less than a year, something called COVID hit the U.S. What was that experience like?
Well, I'll tell you. First, I want to say thank you, Kathleen, and to everybody for inviting me here, and thank you for letting this Hearst lecture be a more of a Q&A. I figured it's better to have a conversation and also give all of you the chance to ask questions rather than just hear me pontificate in windy oratory, so I'll try to avoid that today. I mean, as you probably have heard and experienced yourself, COVID was wild. You know, on the one hand, it was a huge, massive global story that people were hugely interested in and racing to read about. Traffic went like that, and everybody was engaged in it. And on the other hand, it was a big, challenging managerial experience of trying to make sure everybody could get home, get computers, get back, and we could get the news out. And to be honest with you, it was such a rolling adventure for about 6 weeks, we didn't have time to think about it. But actually, that's when newsrooms are at their best, when we're just doing without thinking. Once we stopped to take our breath, then we started to have more problems.
It goes downhill from then on.
Exactly.
The crankiness sets in. Yeah. So you said something earlier today. If we fast forward, thank goodness, to where we are now, does everybody want to come into Manhattan and to Wall Street to work?
No. I think the last 2 years we're dealing with what everybody's dealing with in every business and company, which is habits have set in to work at home. We've got probably, we must probably have 100 people who've started work for us who've never been in the office. They're used to working at home. In a few cases, we have people who've moved away, didn't always know about that. And they have found new rhythms and new ways of working. So persuading them to come in, to be together, in the case of New York, to ride the subway, or New Jersey Transit, which is not ideal in the best circumstances, is a challenge. It's going to be hard to get people back in.
But you do have jobs.
Yes, we have a lot of jobs.
Okay, remember that, because we're going to go back to that, folks. Yeah. So what are you looking for in a journalist today, a young journalist?
A few kind of things and a few ways to think about it in a young journalist. I think first and most fundamentally the work, the quality of the work that you're able to bring. And that means if you're a reporter, the depth of the reporting, the showing me that you've sourced, that you can get people to talk to you, that you can ideate and frame a story, and that you have an interesting way to do that with the story. If you're a graphic designer, that you've got basic graphic design skills and also numeracy, interesting ways of thinking about how numbers interact. If you're a videographer, or it's a similar kind of thing, I just want to see the quality of the work. I think journalism is one of the great things about journalism is the work says an awful lot, and if the work is there and you can produce, that counts for a lot. I think also, though, and it's hard to assess these things. I'd like, ideally, a few traits that I think are helpful in journalism, and you have to forgive me if I talk in some ways about reporters, which is a common habit, because in the newsroom of today, we've got dozens of different kinds of jobs besides reporters, and so it depends on the kind of job you've got. But I feel like the qualities that make great journalists also, to some extent, are personal qualities, and they include curiosity. Are you really curious and interested in the world in lots of different ways? Do you want to learn stuff? Do you want to find stuff out? Are you humble about that? Do you say, I don't know, I need to learn, I need to figure it out? Are you a know-it-all, or are you open? And another one I really think is important to see, and I like to see this demonstrated, is a certain level of empathy. Part of journalism to me is about getting to different stories, different voices, different people, different places, and conveying that back. I think anybody who's got some unique experiences in their background, who's got a different life story or different kinds of experiences as a journalist or reporter, different skills, a different mix of things will stand out a little bit. And I think also, probably more important than it used to be, is a certain ability to work in teams, work with others, be part of a larger positive culture is probably more important than it used to be in journalism. As you probably know, there's a long, deep, rich tradition of newsrooms being, full of difficult, prickly jerks and that kind of thing. And a little of that for Hassan is part of the news business, and it's always going to be there. But realistically, to get the best work out, people have to be able to work with others, because the highest quality work demands so many different skills on so many different platforms. You have to be able to make that work. So those would be a few things.
Catrice Hardy of the Dallas Morning News made that same point, and you said you'd work with her in Virginia. So the era of the lone wolf, who, let's be honest, tended to be an older white male, dominated journalism for so long. And now we're talking teams. But how do you make students who don't look like what that classic journalists look like? How do you, not students or young journalists, how do you make them feel welcome?
In what sense? When you say welcome, when they first come into the newsroom?
Well, I guess journalism has had that culture. And, culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, depending on which version of that quote. How do you change that culture so that people who don't look a certain way or went to a certain school or come from a certain background feel welcomed culturally in a newsroom?
There's a couple different ways to think about it, I guess, and I don't know if I'm going to quite give you the answer you want, so you may have to push me if I don't understand everything. One thing I'd say is, I would say it's lone wolf. There's no room for lone wolves, but there's still room for, super performers and who stand out with unique skills and ways to do it. And so one way I think about it is to differentiate the performance from the romance. An old thing in news is the romance of being the sort of obstreperous asshole who won't talk to anybody and who's difficult and who's prickly and all that. That kind of romantic self-view or cultivation of that character, that's a challenge. But you have super performers who are carrying the ball. There are going to be MVPs, and that's great, and hopefully we'll always have room and draw those. I think the thing you've got to try to consciously do the best you can is to find that balance in culture and in messaging and in even structure between sort of inclusiveness and excellence and balancing them and thinking about both. And you have to be very thoughtful and deliberate about how you structure teams, how you build them, and how you talk to people, how you interact with people, what you celebrate, and make sure people feel included on that score, I guess. I wish I had a more profound, deeper answer. But in some ways
that's a wonderful answer.
In some ways, it really comes down to setting the tone and then having managers who can walk that walk all the time. And by the way, it requires one other thing, and this is true of the leaders and of the people in the newsroom, a certain level of grace, because you are striving for the perfect and you're not going to get there. And sometimes people will, make goofs or say dumb things or, give each other elbows. And there are boundaries to how far you go with that, but you have to acknowledge that some of that's going to happen. Better to talk about it, open it up, clear the air, move on, and allow that each other's going to have to do that as we try to figure out a new way of doing news, I guess.
Have you evolved as a manager?
Well, the good news about journalism is that the managerial bar is so low that if you're a halfway competent manager, you're probably already in a good place. I mean, I'd like to think I have. I mean, you'd really have to ask the people who work for me, Kathleen, on that one. I don't know if they would think I have. I think in news, I would say, newsrooms are, and it goes to this romance thing and also how they work. There's when you're a reporter, when you're a copy editor, when you're in lots of different jobs, there's a kind of a stubborn anti-managerism that takes hold that's part of your personality.
Mm-hmm.
So the truth is, like a lot of people in newsrooms for a long, long time, when I was an editor, I thought, I don't want to have to do that. Those guys, those sellouts and all that. And then you decide, actually, maybe I can do that, or you're asked to do that, or you do opportunities, and you have to learn how to do that. And you've got to find a way to be authentic to yourself, but still the boss. And you have to, and so I would say, even in this job, I have a very hard time sometimes realizing that something I say, which is just me talking to you, might resonate in all kinds of ways that I don't expect.
You are the man.
Or that people need me to say things that I might not want to say, or need to hear things from me that I might not even occur to me that I have to say. And that there's a symbolic value to that. And that also that symbolic value is worth something. Because another challenge, again, one of the great things about journalism, one of the things I always loved about journalism and loved as a reporter, as an editor, is we get to make something every day. Every day you're making a story, you're making a product, you're putting it out there. It may not be perfect, but you're doing it. And a lot of times I'm not making anything. You know, and that's an adjustment. So I'd like to think I've gotten better at understanding those things, but I don't know.
I bet you have. You don't end up as editor of the Wall Street Journal purely on your wonderful charisma.
Often it's the least bad option in the news.
No, you talked about being a reporter and then a copy editor. Something I've, wrestled with is that my going from tiny papers in Texas to a major publication in New York, I don't know if people can do that anymore.
Can do that because the opportunity isn't there?
The opportunity isn't there, or let me rephrase it. Where can that young journalist pick up the skills you want before they get to you? Yeah. How hard is that these days?
It's hard. I just want to say one thing to all of you. When I was it feels to me like last week, it really does, but when I was in my early 20s, I was very ambitious to get to a big city and to a big publication. And I remember sitting there with editors telling me, no, you got to go work at a smaller place. And I was so irritated at how condescending they were and how obnoxious they were. So I don't want to perpetuate that, but they were not wrong. If the opportunity was there, of course, I was fortunate that there was a big ecosystem to do it. I think.
And by the way, he said ecosystem, not ego system.
I started to say ego, but I corrected myself. Journalism is a big ecosystem, though. I did say that. But I don't have as deep and rich a sense in every way as I could about the nonprofits, the startups, the smaller papers, the things that are happening out there, and the challenge of getting from them to a place like ours. And I think the challenge is real. I think do you get the opportunity to do huge stories in the same way that will catch the attention of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal? It's probably tougher. But it is such a great thing when you're at an organization like that, because you get to do everything and you get to do it fast and you get to have an impact. You have to really go out and make a difference in the community on news in every way. So I think that when some people come to the Wall Street Journal, for instance, right out of college, and they're very talented and they're good, but the Wall Street Journal is another big institution. When the Wall Street Journal calls your company, you have to return the call. When I was at the Newport News Daily Press, they didn't have to return my call, and that taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about working the phone, getting people to talk to me, going door to door. I had some experiences that were, they mortified me at the time, but I had some incredibly valuable experiences as a young journalist that I simply couldn't ever have at the Wall Street Journal, and I look back and those informed me frankly, far more than many of my journal experiences have in sort of shaping my career. And so one other thing that's great about a smaller paper, a smaller publication, or a different place, among the many problems I think we've got in journalism today, as you know, journalism is really concentrated more and more into large national publications, very often based in New York, Washington, San Francisco. The opportunity to live in different parts of the United States or the world, the opportunity to go overseas and work overseas, to expose yourself to different parts of the world, of the country, different people, different places to live, is incredibly valuable. So many people, unfortunately, in journalism have a little bit of an urban tunnel vision right now where they're living. And so how to do it is tough, but I will say one other thing. It's prize season. And journalism has a long prize season. And one of the great things that happens in prize season when you're a judge in some committees is you read a lot of work. a lot of work from different publications and papers. And you do discover a lot of people that way. So it is possible, and it does happen, that you get in that way.
That was going to be my next question. And you don't have to name the publications or anything, but are there places that you think of, the people coming from X are really good, and we should always keep an eye out for that publication or that video place or something like that? Or is it just doing a lot of judging?
It's probably a bit of both, I mean, I think there are certain places that are known to be feeders or that are known to cultivate certain kinds of things. But also there are people who just stand out from the pack at different times who take the opportunity. There is one downside to prize publications, I should say, which is, and increasingly this has become the case, they tend to focus on gigantic investigations. And investigations are an important part of journalism, and probably a lot of you want to be investigative reporters who want to go into journalism. And we need good investigators, but we need good basic reporters. We need good beat reporters. We need all kinds of good other experiences that may not get the glamour in that same way or seem to get the glamour. So that's one of the downsides. So you have to look for those people who are breaking scoops, breaking stories. One of the challenges we definitely face at the Wall Street Journal, though, is business coverage has dried up so much at local papers. So we used to, when we were hiring for Boeing, we cover Boeing obviously pretty aggressively. We used to be able to have several of the papers in Texas had great Boeing reporters. Chicago was big on Boeing. Seattle on Boeing. They've all cut back.
Yeah.
So it's a challenge in business a little bit.
So it is that gap. There's the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, blah, 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 LA Times, and then especially in those mid-dailies, there's a lot of suffering. Suffering is not the right word, I'm sorry, when they're real people suffering, but you know what I mean.
They're strained. They're facing an existential challenge every day. I want to go back and say one thing about the Journal I do want to say, which is the other thing. There's one thing I should have said. I think I said this to you earlier. The other thing I want when you come to the Journal, by and large, is for you to want to be at that Journal. And the reason I say that is because there's an aspiration that people have sometimes to be at a national publication, and they'll take any they can get. But I hope if you come to the Journal, you like journalism the way that we do it, and you're interested in business, economics, markets in the broadest sense. We do a lot more than those things, so you don't have to be held to those things. But I hope people who come to the Journal want to be with us.
And not just say they're in New York.
Not just feel they're in New York or at some big, place.
Talking about the Journal, up until fairly recently in their lifetimes, the Journal was, the place for business news. And you look at it every day, and except for Sunday, and there's Ukraine, incredible, general news. Talk a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah, we try to find the line. I mean, I think the way I think about it and talk about it with our team, we're still at the core, I think, broadly speaking, in the broadest sense, business, markets, economics. And as I like to say, and I get on my high horse about it, those are not narrow topics. Those are gigantic, tectonic, titanic forces that drive the world. And probably, because I was this way, if I say markets, gosh, that seems, a little bit boring. So to a lot of people, they say so much about so many things. They're so important on so many ways. And we write also about our jobs, our lives, how much money we make, the products that we use. That's the heart of the Wall Street Journal. And then with that, we've got an audience that is, an ambitious audience, not just CEOs, not just senior people in companies, but people who want to achieve things or go places or make money or find their path. Could be in philanthropy. And those people want to be well informed by a good news source on a lot of different things to really help understand the world. So covering Ukraine or China, where I think we have a huge presence in China, cover China very aggressively. You really can't understand the modern world. You really can't understand business, economics, politics without understanding China really, really well. So we try to think, what are those areas where our readers are going to expect that they need to be informed, where we can bring something to them? And that's broadly how we try to think about it.
You talk about covering China, which you do extraordinarily well. Talk about challenges, since that's part of the title, the challenges of trying to cover China, especially when the government, like many people here in the U.S., confuse opinion with news.
No. By the way, I apologize for the long title. I think we dashed that off. And I
No,
saw
you,
the
yeah,
poster
you
out
made
there. It
you
was
made the
very
title,
long.
not me. No.
I should have edited it down. Look, China's become much more of a challenge in the last 5 years. I mean, famously, I don't know, many of you probably don't know about this, but and on the news and opinion front, right? So the Wall Street Journal has been on the mainland in China since 1980. We were there for 42 years. And as the Chinese government has become more aggressive about foreign coverage, and then there was a spat between the Chinese government and the U.S. State Department over journalists, where under Trump, the State Department was saying many of the Chinese journalists here were spies, and they were getting into tit for tat. Right in the middle of this, our opinion page at the Journal, which is, at the Journal, we run news and opinion completely separately. News reports to me, opinion reports to my colleague Paul Gigot, and we both report to the publisher. The staffs are totally separate. But to your point, that's not the common structure around the world, and that's certainly not the structure in China. And so they published a headline. This was only 3 years ago.
5 years ago?
No,
3 or 5 years?
3 years ago.
Okay.
I think it was the year before COVID. They published a headline that the Chinese seized on as deeply offensive, and it led to most of our reporters being expelled. And editors, I think we had about 10 people who were tossed out. And we were down to, all the American reporters were tossed out. So we've gone down to 3 non-American reporters who work for us in China. And eventually the New York Times, the Washington Post, other news organizations were tossed out as well, who were American news organizations. When you're in China reporting, you are almost certainly your phone is going to be bugged. You have to hire Chinese language researchers who help you, and they do help you, but many of them are going to be pressured routinely by the party or the government either to spy on you or called in to ask questions about what you're doing and stories. And you're facing pressure sort of on an ongoing basis, and we've got a large presence in Hong Kong that we've had for even longer than the mainland, and they're now facing that same kind of pressure too. So the Chinese are getting far more aggressive, and not just the Chinese, right? I don't know if you've talked about this in your class, but after the Ukraine war started, in Russia, they passed a new media law only about 3 or 4 weeks ago, essentially saying any media organizations can't refer to a war in Russia. You have to, I forget the phrase, it's like necessary military action or something like that. And we aren't sure whether our bureau chief could stay in or not. Right now she's out because she could face arrest. So there's a lot of pressure, and I think China's been leading the way, and you have to try to hang in there the best you can. But they do not distinguish. I'll get called about twice a year in New York. Typically the consul general from China will want to come yell at us about something that they wrote on the opinion page.
As I said, people here in the U.S. have a problem telling the opinion page from the regular pages. We looked at a case study in class also in which people on the news side felt so strongly about what had gone on the opinion side. And our era, well, I'm going to say my era because I am way older than he is.
Not true.
That wouldn't have happened, but that happened at the Wall Street Journal, at the New York Times, and at other publications. So is that separation as strong as it has been, or what's going on there in your opinion?
A couple things. The separation is, I think, quite strong at our organization, but I think, and I mean airtight. To give you an example of the Times, and I know you worked at the Times. At the Times, editors might go from news over to opinion and back to news. That has happened sometimes. I think that doesn't happen at the Wall Street Journal. Separate staffs, separate pipelines, and everything else. You could theoretically go from news over to opinion, but you're not coming back to news. You're making a commitment. We actually have had, I think there actually were challenges on this front in the 60s during civil rights and Vietnam battles at times. Look, I think digital has blurred the lines. So to be fair to people who don't know the difference between news and opinion, it's much harder to tell in digital. It's much less clear. And all these things that were very clear in the print days when you had, different looking pages and headers become blurrier on digital. So, I mean, there's one Wall Street Journal, so the news stories dominate our social media channel, but opinion can go on social media sometimes too. So that's a big challenge. And I think most surveys, you probably talked about this, suggest most readers don't get the difference between the two digitally, and people who've grown up digitally. I think there's a broader existential thing that's happening more in discourse and culture, which is both on news and on news and opinion. On news, there's obviously a much larger debate happening about the value of so-called objectivity and what that means, and does it make sense, and this argument about, our job is to be, truth, not objectivity. Excuse me. And then I think there's the limitations that news reporters self-impose versus the perceived freedom of opinion writers, and the things that they can get away with that news reporters can't get away with. And then there's the debate about how does opinion leak into news stories, and aren't you guys biased? And it becomes very easy to stir up those tensions. I mean, look, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, just for the interest of candor too, our opinion pages are the leading conservative opinion pages in the United States. And so I think on a personal level, plenty of reporters are probably not personally in step with those pages. So sometimes they just really vehemently disagree with the pages, and they feel, I don't want to work in an organization that also will say those things. And so all of those things are happening right now.
So we've touched on some of the challenges. There are many, many more, but let's talk a little bit about the opportunities.
Well, I could say a lot, but is there anything particularly?
No, this is your show.
My lecture. Well, look, first of all, I understand that there's I recognize there's lots of different kinds of journalists and lots of different ways into journalism, including opinion journalism, which I think is a great field in which a lot of people want to do. So I'm speaking from the perspective of news journalism. I'll start with two basic ones, and then you could come at me. First of all, no matter what are the existential challenges of the business, no matter what the business model issues, the finances, the issues, the challenges, the world needs and will always need objective, reported, deep, rich, fact-based information. They need it. In fact, in today's world, it's more important than ever because we're drowning in so much crap information. So the opportunity and excitement of doing that, of going out, finding stories, and bringing that kind of information is still there. It's as rich as it's ever been. The economics are a bit challenged, admittedly, but if you love doing it, and if you're passionate about it, and if you can have fun doing it, and it's important work, the world needs it. However the business models shake out, the world will need that. We're going to be in big, big trouble if the world doesn't need that anymore, and people want it, and they will respond to it. When Ukraine happened, we just came off our best traffic month, second best traffic month ever at the Wall Street Journal because of Ukraine. Because when a big complicated event like that happens in Europe, people want to understand it. They want reliable sources of information. I think we are one, and people will need that. The second thing in our space, and again, we do a lot of things besides business, but when I think about the business markets, economic space, there are a billion great and important stories to do that nobody is doing. Journalism, sadly, as it's gotten smaller, has to some extent narrowed itself a little bit. And I think one thing that has happened is that the United States of America as a whole, you probably agree with me about this, is less well covered than it has been in my lifetime. Washington, D.C. is very well covered, almost to a fault. There's a billion people in Washington doing politics reporting, and that's great if that's what you want to do. But there are fantastic and interesting stories everywhere you turn to write and that people should hear about. Some of them are important accountability stories. Some of them are more inspiring stories. There's some of them are really troubling stories. But the opportunity is there to do that, find stories, and make a difference that way too. I think big. I think actually bigger than it used to be.
As an editor, as the editor-in-chief, I like it's the and in chief, how do you make sure that Washington doesn't suck all the resources out? The New Yorker did a fabulous story on stink bugs. And I know that sounds weird, but it was a fabulous story, and it was during the Trump administration time. And what stood out to me is that there used to be all kinds of stories like that in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
So even the New Yorker felt the need to go all Washington.
It's exhausting. I think that one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, in this data-driven age, is that Washington and politics, which is the most engaging blood sport we have in this country, will make your numbers go off the needles, and so you'll engage people, but for a small audience, because it'll turn a lot of other people off, and there's less chance of discovery. People, you used to get the New Yorker, this is true, you used to get the New Yorker because you trusted their judgment and their writers, and they would bring you all kinds of strange esoteric stories every week that you would enlighten you. It really isn't like that too much anymore.
I know.
And I think that's why a lot of people have turned off journalism, because even if they feel very vehemently partisan one way or the other, it's exhausting with a lot of us. In our case, it's important that we cover Washington. We have to cover it robustly. Like everybody else, we got some things right on Donald Trump and some things wrong. But we also, I try to always be aware that part of Donald Trump's MO is to mud wrestle everybody, pull you down to his level, and then beat you up. And that he wanted to do that to the press. And unfortunately, he had a lot of success doing that. And our job is not to get in the arena and fight with him. Our job is to write about the spectacle and not become players. So we tried to keep that in mind. And we tried to keep the Washington coverage versus other things in some perspective. So we have a robust, large Washington bureau, but we try to think, what are the stories that are going to stand out for us? What are the different things for us? And how do we be as straight and accessible to people across the political spectrum as we can be? And you just, it's a daily trudge in doing that. So,
Tell us about the story that made you want to work for the Wall Street Journal.
because I was telling you about that story.
Yes. And how that's the type of thing that the Journal has always done, but maybe people don't think of the publication in that way.
I'll tell you two stories if I can in a different way, because one was before I went there and one was after I went there. I had no interest in business reporting when I started out, when I was young, and in fact it seemed really boring. And in those days the Wall Street Journal did not have photos, did not run any art, and had many more pages, and it was really gray, really gray. So it really seemed even more boring. And I had an opportunity to apply for a job there when I was a police reporter. And that day they happened to have run a feature story on the front page. The Journal has a long, rich tradition in journalism of running deep, broad feature stories. And in fact, many of them are business oriented in the biggest way, but there are some famous ones. So there was an absolutely marvelous story. I'll send it to you, from 1991. And it was, in 1991, HIV and AIDS were still raging around the United States. There was no retrovirus cure or treatment, and to get HIV was, almost, not entirely, but almost a death sentence for people. And one of our reporters has spent almost a year with this family, in which, and it was about a family from Oklahoma, I think. It was an older couple. They had one son. And they loved their son, but he was the father, and he didn't connect that much. And he ended up moving to Chicago, going into the theater community, and one day he told his parents he was gay, and he was very unsure how they were going to react, and particularly his father, who was kind of a taciturn Oklahoma guy, and his father basically said, I don't understand you, but I love you, and gave him a hug, and that sort of became a different mode for the family. And eventually they discovered that the son had HIV. And it's very moving. The story makes me tear up when I think about it. And this couple, there's a scene in the story where the couple just sits up crying all night when their son is called them to tell them he has HIV. And they moved to Chicago, and as he got sick and deteriorated, they took care of him. They also met all of his friends. They discovered that he was this incredibly giving, generous person who was doing volunteer work and working with people. And this very tough guy, taciturn Oklahoma dad and the son really, really bonded and really grew close. And I'm sorry but it's the story that moved me. As you can see, it still moves me. It was published 31 years ago. And it's just a beautiful human tale about this family in this difficult circumstance. And it's a reminder that some of the best journalism and some of the hardest journalism to produce gets a human face on real things that we're talking about. And also a reminder that people are people. I know that sounds corny, but I can imagine if as I'm talking and thinking about it, I'm thinking about those same characters. I can imagine how different forces in our media today might portray the gay son in theater in Chicago or the tough guy, taciturn Oklahoman. Different places might portray each of them with a lot less sympathy and a lot more one-dimensionally. And I like journalism that brings textured multidimensionality. Story ends at a beautiful note because when the son, after he passed away, they discovered that he wanted to be buried next to his father. That was the wish he left. So it was a beautiful kicker. And it was just a beautifully underwritten story. And it was partly the theme, but it was also the reporting, the depth of human emotion, and the beautiful underwriting of the story. So that
before you tell the second one, for those of you in my class, remember how we talked about the best feature writing? Professor Robbins said access is one of the keys, and to spend a year with the family. And he touched on the things that Professor Robbins said. Feature writing, brings moods, brings emotions. It touches you. So this is what we've been discussing.
It's a lot harder today, I have to admit, in today's 24/7 full court press digital world. It's a lot harder for people to break out and do those kinds of stories and find the time and the room to do them. But when they're done well, they still stand out as some of the best. Bad features are bad features, but great features are the best. So I'll fast forward to a much more prosaic thing, but it was equally impactful. So after I was at the Journal for a few years and I bounced around on a few beats, I ended up covering General Electric. So that's really exciting, General Electric Company. When I covered them in the late 90s, it was generally the biggest company in the world, or one of them. And it was run by this very feisty, activist, difficult, ornery CEO named Jack Welch. He was a very controversial figure. So you chuckled. I understand totally. Get to cover GE. How exciting is that? Well,
so GE was the Google and Disney of its day.
It really was. And Jack Welch was like the Steve Jobs in that era. Except that what you discovered and what I always learned from that was GE is a gigantic institutional force in this country that nobody's covering. They employed 300,000 people. They made jet engines. They made power turbines. They had half their workforce overseas. They were a pioneer in offshoring, shutting down plants and relocating jobs overseas. It was this incredibly, at one point they had one of the biggest investment banks on Wall Street and it blew up in a scandal. And I realized business reporting is a lens on everything. GE is one of the most important and influential ways of affecting our lives. By the way, they were also the biggest non-bank financial provider in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of millions of people had GE credit cards and GE insurance products. They touched everything. And so that was influential in its own way, which is I had this wide open, incredibly important company, stories everywhere, a lens on everything, and nobody's writing about it. Nobody's there. That was the thing that really made me think business reporting is a window to fantastic stories that really matter, and they were way undercovered then. It's maybe worse now.
So you tell your staffers, look, GE and all these things, they're important. I mean, do you still have, even though they're at the Journal, are there some people that you kind of have to get them to be excited about?
Sure, yeah. Because people want to write their gigantic stories and their investigations. And, news is sometimes boring, especially when you've been doing it for a long time. But yeah, that's part of my job is to get people to think deeply and inspire that. Plus, and those of you who've worked in business know, it is full of human drama. It's just full of human drama. Management stories, fights, battles. It's just endlessly fascinating. Everything's a business story. I mean, think about sports. You were a sports reporter. One of the biggest business stories right now is going to be what legalized gambling is going to do to our sports in this country. You can already see it changing. I was at an event about 5 weeks ago, and the director of marketing for the NFL was on stage, and I will tell you, he is not ready for it. He was completely glib, and we asked him, what's going to happen with the first scandal? The first player who, got a payoff and dropped that. Oh, it's fine. We're on it.
And then scandal has already happened.
Yeah.
They've already had one player suspended.
Yeah. So and that's going to change sports. And if you don't have some sense of money, you're not getting the story. However, if you have some business sense or sense of money, you'll be a better sports reporter for doing that. Same thing with the NCAA. Now that athletes can
NIL.
a profit. It's same. It's so I just think of it as a lens and a way to open the door to almost anything.
Okay, so let's talk about journalism broadly. At one point when you're saying what you need to be a good reporter, you said objective, Were those slashes or were those commas?
Objective, curious.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, meaning how do you perceive objectivity as a term?
It's never been my favorite term, and that's even before the big debate around objectivity, because it's not quite the right word for what I think is important, because not everything is equal. Now, I do think some of the people who are arguing against objectivity sometimes mischaracterize it. They have a straw man. No editor who was worth their salt ever said, treat every single person absolutely equally no matter what they say. And good journalism, good writing, good editing. Writing is in a certain level, frankly, an inherently subjective process. It's not an objective process. You are making choices about what to include. You're making choices about what to say. You're thinking about the angle. You're thinking about who to talk to. And so there's a way that objectivity is like a false god, I guess I would say. So
Gay Tuckman called it a strategic ritual.
I think, but at least in news reporting of the kind that we want to do, fairness is a better term, but even fairness doesn't quite capture it. What you're trying to do...
Can we pause for a second?
Yeah.
So, class, what's the problem with the term fairness? Anybody remember that discussion? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, she said fair to whom?
Yeah.
So...
I mean, I think what you're trying to do, I think I talked about the importance in journalism of humility and curiosity. What you're trying to do is take on board different views, different ways of thinking, different opinions, be open to them, and get as close to the truth as you can, knowing that what you see as the truth may not be the same thing as the truth, and therefore being aware that you also are a person with, your own views and biases and ways of framing things, and at least having some self-awareness to try to compensate for that. That was the most long-winded thing I said, but it's something like that. Really what it boils down to in a certain sense is judgment. And over time, users will judge a publication, will judge a writer, will judge an editor on their judgment. Do they think that they're basically getting it right and being open and fair, but also, one thing.
No, go ahead.
That's not a plea for false equivalence, let's say, or false equality, if you know what I mean. So it's tricky, but it's a messy process, and you have to own the fact that it's a messy process. And objectivity, while it sometimes I think is a bit of a straw man, is also a hobby horse that people beat that is a different way of confronting the issue.
It's an easy target in some ways. Though I do think it has been used as a weapon against journalists of color or journalists from marginalized groups, because they're often the ones who are deemed not objective.
I think there can be, I'm going to be careful not to comment on any ongoing issues involving some of my competitors, but I think there can be times with journalists of color or women where things that would be human things are perceived as political or biased things because they're expressed by women or journalists of color, if you know what I mean.
Right, and the judge's ruling recently, I'm sure you're familiar with it. I'm going to overly simplify this case, but a reporter at the Washington Post who is a victim of sexual assault by another journalist, and she's accusing another journalist who has denied that. This is kind of complicated.
It's a messy case.
She is the one who originally tweeted after Kobe Bryant's death, why, she tweeted out the fact that he had been arrested and ultimately had a civil case. He'd been arrested for rape, and it was settled out of court. She reminded people that in a tweet and was suspended by the Washington Post, right? So after...
Can I add one other thing? Mm-hmm. Also, but very relevant also, was I think the Post had told her before Kobe died, because she had said she was a victim of sexual assault, that there was a story or a trial or something she couldn't cover. I think that was part of it too, that because she'd been a victim, she couldn't cover, I forget which trial or story it was.
So
it might have been Trump claim or something like that.
So fast forward a couple of months later or something, she sues the Post because they won't let her cover anything that involves sexual assault. A judge ruled that the Post could not be sued for discrimination because they hadn't removed her from general reporting, and that the Post has the right to protect its readers by having the appearance of impartiality. So it's kind of complicated, but do you think this ruling, or how do you think this ruling is going to play out, if at all, in other newsrooms?
I don't know if it's going to have a huge influence in other newsrooms. I think newsrooms are really grappling with issues of social media and how journalists conduct themselves on social media, and what they say and what that says about how they're perceived. And they're grappling with all these kinds of inclusivity issues, and they're sometimes really blowing it, I guess is what I'd say, without getting too specific. And so I don't know how that will play out, particularly in other places. I think you have to try. They're very difficult issues to manage, and they're very complicated issues, and so you have to try to think about fairness and applying the same standards to everybody, and making those standards very, very clear to everybody. And again, I hate to keep coming back to the word, using good judgment in how you deal with people in situations. And it's a more even to be fair, I don't want to talk about this one, but even to be fair to my competitors on this, it becomes more challenging to get it right, and how people perceive what you've done becomes more challenging than it used to be too. And so it's a mess in some ways. But that in no way is that to suggest that I think the Post did the right thing or handled it well, or that we would do that.
It's a mess. You make me think of something that's in Kovac, and I don't know if it's Kovac or Kovac, and Rosenstill's book, The Elements of Journalism, which the class is reading. They say that the essential product of journalism is trust, not truth, but trust. Discuss.
Well, it's funny because we like to brag all the time about how trusted we are, and I think most surveys show the Wall Street Journal to be, the most trusted or more trusted than any other mainstream legacy publication. I think there's a lot to that. I don't know if I could refine it to say the most or the most important, but you are in a trust relationship with your members and your readers. And we have a trust crisis in journalism. There's no doubt about that. And people express it. We have a trust crisis at every institution. And I do think news organizations don't take that issue seriously enough and think about what people expect of us. Can I go back to the last one for 1 second?
Oh, absolutely, please.
One thing I think that is interesting to think in that case or in other cases is it gets to be a very tricky thing when you go. So if you're a journalist, you're trying to do two things at once. You are a real person, and you have to be aware of that. I don't want you to turn off your real personhood. And you're a journalist who has to sort of try to conduct in a certain way along journalistic ethics. There's a challenge in an example like the Post one, though, where people could have conflicts or perceive conflicts everywhere you turn if you wanted it to be that way. And I'm thinking about it because our best reporter in Ukraine, who's been an international reporter for the Wall Street Journal for several decades and been in Afghanistan and all over the world, is Ukrainian. And so he's back in Ukraine, covering what's happening in Ukraine in his home country, and he's doing a phenomenal job. And I've heard one or two people, I don't know if you should let him cover Ukraine, he's Ukrainian. And you think, but where do you draw that line? How do you figure that kind of thing out? And you could go through a newsroom and see all of those kinds of challenges and conflicts. Because, and so I think it's easy to get very much caught up. What I would expect, I'd say this to our journalists, I really have your politics, have your personal opinion. I'm not going to tell you not to do that. And then understand what you need to do as a journalist. You should be able to separate those things out.
How to use your authority.
Yeah.
It's interesting because...
I'm sorry to...
Yeah.
And that goes to the trust thing as well, which is one of the reasons people don't trust journalists right now is we don't always separate those two things very well. And what they want from the Wall Street Journal is factual journalism about the things that we cover, and sometimes we can get in the way of that but we're still capable of reporting it. I'm not explaining it very well, but all these things are getting mixed up a little bit in the world of social media, all this branding stuff and sort of self-promotion, and it's getting tricky. The key is stick to your mission and deliver on your mission and let people know that's what you're doing and engage with them, by the way, seriously. I mean, I get reader letters every day. You guys are biased on this, biased on that, and stupid on this. And, I'd say every day I write a couple readers back and say, you're wrong and here's why. And more often...
You go down that rabbit hole.
You know what? More often than not, this is true. More often than not, they don't expect that they're going to hear back from me. And if I talk to them straight and say, you're wrong and here's why, and sometimes they actually really appreciate it.
So how can I say this? These are people who are sending you reasonably
Mostly.
coherent, even if they're not.
Yeah, I don't engage with like insanity and racism and stuff like that. But they have their view and they're pushing back. One thing that's happened in the world of today, unfortunately, and I try to keep this in mind, is there's in this mass communications world, there's so many people. This is true on social media too. People are developing the habit that you have to scream really loud at any hopes of being heard. So everybody goes to extremes right away in their tone and their rhetoric. So I get these letters from people, and they're like, you stupid idiot, and I send them a nice letter back, but very directly respond, I disagree with you, and they turn really nice really fast. It's really funny.
That can be so hard, though, if part of your identity is attacked.
Yeah.
In that process.
It's very hard. It is very hard, and I don't mean to make light of it.
Oh, no.
But the worst people will go right for your most personal features, your identity. They will attempt to really hurt you. Women, people of color, will generally get the worst of it. And these days, journalists do face that a lot.
Catrice Hardy at ISOJ, which I want to give a shout out to. It was amazing for those of you who attended. It's the International Symposium on Online Journalism. And if you didn't go this year, plan on going next year. Anyway.
I'm going to go. It sounded good.
Yeah, you're invited. Catrice Hardy, who's the editor of the Dallas Morning News, was talking about, I'd asked her a question about online harassment of women, and she goes, it's not just women. She told the story of a reporter who had to change all of his banking accounts and a whole bunch of stuff and da-da-da-da-da. Here's the part that got me. He never told his bosses this was going on. I mean, if you were a boss and you heard that, what does that say about, this was before she got there. What would you think in that situation?
I mean, obviously it would depend a bit on the circumstances, but I'm sure my initial reaction would be to be horrified. Why didn't you come tell us? We could help you out. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's how I'd feel. Now, some people would be like, no, I can deal with this, or they'd tough it out. You'd have to kind of get in deep with what exactly they were thinking. But I'd be horrified with an extreme situation like that.
And I guess that leads me to my last question for now. If you have a question, you can go to the mics that are on either end. If you're in J301F, my class, Actually, let's do this for everybody. Give us your name, your classification, and your major. And then your question, okay? There will be no clearing of throats. That means you don't need a long lead into the question. Just get us to the question if possible, okay?
I feel like I'm at one of those school board meetings where people are going to come to the mics and start attacking me.
But we do want your questions, even though I said, ta-da. Just sometimes at these things, people give like 5-minute lead-ins to questions. So what is it, and as editor-in-chief, how much are you into people's lives?
Well, it's a tricky thing. It's a great question. And it's really a mixed bag because, part of what's happening in society and happening in the workplace right now is kind of a redrawing of the lines and what is appropriate and what not. And with people I know or people I've built a relationship with, I'm somewhat involved, and I tell them to come to me. I ask about their kids. I try to tell every manager all the time. I tried to do this throughout the pandemic. Work matters, but not at the expense of people's lives. I've tried to tell managers, talk to your folks, see where they're at, see what they need. Sometimes you can sense that there's something going on with people and they're a little reticent, and maybe you want to see if you could help pull it out. But you also don't want to intrude on people's privacy and get in their way. These things are always happening, but the pandemic tended to, in some ways, amplify and magnify things. People lost loved ones. People have substance abuse challenges or marital problems, or their kids are suffering. And, where you can help and where you can send the message, we're here to help. We're here to help you think it through. We're here to do what we can. You try to be as available as you can on that, and you try to find opportunities, as we did a few times, to talk broadly to some things about that. And I certainly will do what I can do. But at the same time, I try to figure out what's your line. Some people just don't want to talk about it. We have my boss, actually, his father just passed away, and he's a very reserved guy, and he's got a firm line between work and his personal life. So I sent him a note. I gave him my sympathies, and next time we met, he said thank you, and it was to work, to business, and I tried to take his. He's got a. So I think one thing, I guess that's the last thing I'd say, is that you try to make sure you give people the autonomy to set those terms with you a little bit, and that's complicated, but you have to reach out and let people do that.
Is that what you would almost call newsroom safety? There was talking about a place where staffers feel safe to be wherever they are.
Yeah, I guess sort of, but I guess I would say it's interesting. A lot of people don't bring stuff to me. They don't want me to know. They'll go to my managing editor, or they'll go to somebody on her team, or they'll go to their immediate boss, and then their immediate boss doesn't want me to know what's going on. And it's almost so complicated and multifaceted. I don't know if I could call it a system exactly. I think my job as editor, we have 1,300 people. I can't be involved in all their lives, and God knows they wouldn't want me to be, is to set the tone and the expectation for all the leaders and everybody in the organization about how to treat people and how to take those kind of conversations. And hopefully that's playing out in different ways, and some of them most of them I'll never know. So I don't know if I'd exactly think of it as safety in this sort of.
But creating a culture.
Yeah.
Creating a culture. I do want to add, if you're in my class, this would count as a participation point if you ask a question.
No.
So I want to see some people up now.
And if it's a great question. I'll say one thing on the culture thing on that too, Kathleen, which is, yes, you want to set that, and you have to reinforce that pretty steadily. Because we were talking about newsroom romance earlier. There's also sort of a stoic, tough it up, I don't want to hear it kind of a thing that I think is not acceptable. No, I've had. I'll say one other thing. Sorry, now you got me thinking. Also, when you're at the top, you always think it's great, and the problem is in the middle. So I might say something but there might be the new mom who needs a day off to be with her baby, and the boss says, nope, it's a working day. And I may or may not hear about that. Sorry.
This thing. Yeah, we're on. Okay, cool. So Emmanuel Ramirez, third year, English major.
For now, English.
Huh?
Yes, English major.
So I kind of wanted to ask you, how do you feel about like the saying, the worst anybody can say is no when pertaining to journalism, whether you're trying to find a story or you're trying to connect with somebody or something like that? Like, how would you...
In what
how do you feel
context?
about
What do you mean? You mean when you're trying to get somebody to talk to you?
Yeah, like just I know, like in our sense, right? We're I personally work for the Daily Texan, which is the publication here at Texas, and I remember we were doing a story on Olympians who came from Texas and are now going to Tokyo, and I messaged Kevin Durant on Instagram and I tweeted at him, and I mean he didn't get back to me, but I thought how cool it would have been if he did. And so it's just the thought of the worst somebody can say is no.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's a good saying. And I think as long as you're respectful and professional and you know when no means no, I think you should always do that. One of the things when I say you should be curious as a journalist and you should be humble, so one of the things I think is there are always more sources to have. There are always more people to reach out to. You're never done. You could have been covering your beat for 10 years, and if you're not making new sources and meeting new people, you're not doing the job. So you've got to be out there. And yes, the worst thing they can say is no. I think it's good.
Thank you very much.
I mean, if there's nobody else, I got another one. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You can get back in line. So.
As you mentioned previously, the line between news and...
Could you identify yourself, please?
Oh,
and a
I'm
little bit
sorry.
closer to the mic, a little bit closer.
My name is Amaya Austin. I am a first-year journalism major. And you mentioned earlier that the line between news and opinion can be quite vague with digital journalism emerging. This might be a big question, but what are the ways that we can reintroduce or redraw that line as digital journalism continues to grow? And have you noticed or enforced new methods to reconstruct this line?
Yeah, it's a big ongoing conversation in journalism, as you say, Maya. There's not one easy answer. I can tell you what we try to do is extremely aggressive labeling so that you know it's opinion versus news. And then I really do try the best I can. It's a little tricky, but to make sure our news reporters, when they're presenting themselves as Wall Street Journal reporters, are not engaging in opinion. They're not fighting with the opinion side. I try to tell them we're one Wall Street Journal. We have to be collegial, and mostly that works pretty well. But it's a bit of a challenge, And we've probably most recently, most famously with Hunter Biden, we've had some moments where people really wanted to make it an issue for us. But you just try to you try to label, you try to make it very clear the context in which people are reading things. And you try to differentiate the behavior of the staff enough so that people know the right way to do things. So,
Thank you.
But there's a big we haven't solved that problem yet.
Hi, my name is Kennedy. I'm a sophomore sport management major, actually. And my question, kind of going off what she said, I don't know if I missed it, but you said your colleague Paul with the opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the opinion staff. Do you work with him a lot? And kind of like in COVID, did you ever really?
No, we're
Never
cordial
really?
because we both are running different newsrooms, so we get along and we're cordial and we're both part of the journal. But no, he runs his shop, I run my shop.
So y'all stay
and
pretty separate, mostly?
Yeah, occasionally we'll. I mean, what is interesting sometimes is it was simpler in the print era because everything was done at the printing plant. He had his pages and we had our pages. So sometimes we have to share like digital resources or think about how to do that. But his editorial judgment is his and mine is mine, and we do not mix it up.
Okay, thank you.
Of what he was talking about earlier, at the Times, top editors can go from the newsroom to the opinion and back to the newsroom in charge. And that doesn't happen at the Wall Street
Paul
Journal.
Gigot started as a reporter in Chicago, and then he went to the opinion side in like 1988, and he didn't come back. And that's happened a couple times. But there would not be back and forth that way.
Hi, my name is Chloe Porras. I'm a first-year journalism major. I was wondering if there was ever a point where you wanted to give up on journalism, or what keeps you like pushing every day to continue what you're doing?
There were a lot of times when I was young I wanted to give up on it, and I'd say I probably have one of those moments about every 2 weeks now sometimes, because truly I sometimes despair of the state of discourse, or the pressures are a lot. You know, the pressures of people who I mean, journalists are under a lot of fire. They don't like journalism, and they want to come at us, and it's tough sometimes. And we are human. We get it wrong every day. We never get it right, as right as we could. So yeah, I have those moments. When I was younger and starting out, I remember really waffling on whether journalism was right for me, because some of the things that we all complain about, the media, you know, they've always been there. The media has problems. And stories like the one that I mentioned, and sorry I went on about it for so long, or other things made me think, no, actually, but there is the media, but you can do great work. You can do important things in this field. And I thought, it's probably the same in medicine, you know? 10% of doctors are like shady crooks. That doesn't make the other 90% invalid. So you can go in this and do honorable work, and I try to remember that and make a difference. So that's what I try to remind myself. When I was young, that's what kept me in, and that's what I try to remind myself otherwise.
Awesome, thank you.
My name is Lulia Pan. I'm an international relations major, and my question is that you mentioned some experiences that mortified you while working as a young journalist. Can you talk about one of those experiences and how to avoid them, or if they're unavoidable?
Remind me the context of saying I was mortified, because I have many, but...
You were talking about mistakes that you were as working at like smaller publications and moving on to larger
there was a good
publications.
one once when I was an intern in the Miami Herald, back when it was a huge paper. I was in the West Palm Beach Bureau in 1985, and I was sent out to cover a police funeral. And, you know, 1985, police funeral, everybody loves a police funeral. They love the police. I couldn't find the police funeral. I couldn't find my way there. I know, isn't that painful? So I come back to the office. They gave me what was an easy assignment for the young, stupid kid, and even then I couldn't fulfill it. And we ended up, big police funeral, big local news story, running a photo with a caption that I barely was able to fill out. That's pretty bad. That was. Thanks for re-traumatizing me. Yeah. And I've got more though.
Hi, my name is Ethan Jensen. I'm a freshman chemistry major. So in 2013, Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post and kind of turned around what a lot of people saw as like a downward sloping business. My question is, how much do you think that the influence of people with money and grand power have had on the like integrity of journalism, and how much have they contributed to like journalistic bias within the companies that they run?
It's a good question, a good thing to think about. You know, there's an old, one of my favorite writers, all of you are way too young to remember, but one of the writers who made me really want to go into journalism back long ago at the New Yorker, they had the original press critic was a guy named A.J. Liebling, and he's a fantastic journalist. And he used to say, freedom of the press belongs to the guy that owns one. This is one of the many sayings of his I've tucked away. I mean, I think that integrity is a tricky way to think about it, because the Washington Post and every news organization has every serious news organization has major standards and ethics standards. Believe me, I mean, I work for Rupert Murdoch, and believe me, the how he treats the Wall Street Journal, and people wouldn't believe how good he is at giving us the space and the freedom that we need given his reputation. He upholds the Journal, the integrity, all the editorial lines in the best way possible, and he's been a great boss for us. So I don't know if I think about it exactly in integrity, but it is hard. There's always going to be a risk when you have owners who are powerful, rich people, as you're suggesting, that how you think about things like powerful, rich people, or how you think about Amazon, or how you think about your company will be influenced. It's a constant challenge and thing to wrestle with. And it also might orient and inform in some ways how you think about the world. You know, I think, I don't want to say anything critical of the Post. That's not my intent here. But in many ways, I don't think he's wanted it or in any way to influence the journalism of the Post at all, or has in any way tried to put his finger on the scale from any story. Anybody I know who's ever been at the Post, that's what I've heard. So I don't think that he's interfering in news stories or driving coverage or wanting to do that. But how he is evolving the company and the way that they structure and do things and experiment is in keeping with how he thinks about how to run Amazon and do businesses. And you'd have to wonder to the extent to which that might influence how you think about those things and how you think about technology. By saying that, I'm in no way trying to impugn their integrity, but I think part of you have to think about those things a little bit as an editor and try to think about the pathways in which you've got to play it straight and where you could go wrong. So it is one of the challenges to manage. It's probably not a very satisfying answer, right? But that's you have to be aware of it, I'd say.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sally James. I'm a first-year journalism student, and I was just wondering what advice you have for young journalists trying to get their foot in the door. Like, where should we be spending our most time and energy to get the most valuable experiences?
It probably depends on exactly what you want to do in terms of, obviously if you want to be making videos versus writing stories. But my basic advice is anywhere, in any way that you can produce journalism that will be published, that will be edited by somebody, that will be published, that has the chance to be read, that gets out there, that gets exposure, so that people can see your work and you can learn that way. I would just seize every opportunity you could to do that and produce. That's the best way to spend your time, in my view.
Thank you.
My name is Jackson. I'm a second-year philosophy major, and I was going to ask you.
I have to tell you, I wish I'd majored in philosophy. I often do, seriously.
I was going to ask, how well covered do you think climate economics is at the Wall Street Journal, or maybe environmental economics?
Climate economics. Better than it used to be, but probably not where it should be at this point. We've wrestled with the right way to cover it, and I think we're getting there, but I don't think we're where we could be yet. Well, what do you think? You obviously have a view on it.
Well, I don't know. Like, I was asking because I didn't really know like how much you guys do it, but I think that there could be like seeing. I think if you saw it a lot more in the presence of the media, then more people would be thinking about it and conscious of it.
I'd like to think that, but I don't know if we have that much influence. I mean, I would say that I would say from where I sit, it's interesting that you phrase it as climate economics, and the reason I say it is because I think climate change is not often covered as an economic story. It's covered as a science or as a catastrophe story. As serious as the climate issue is, I'm almost tired of reading stories that say we're running out of time, because I think, well, are we going to die in 2040, every one of us? I mean, I suppose that's,
They're younger, so they care.
I understand that, but it's like it's a very serious issue, and it's a complicated, large, abstract, but very real issue to cover. And so it's very serious, but to scare me the same way loses its power over time. So that's part of what I'm saying, is that, we all are that way. We're all going to get inured to that. The economics angle which is part of the unique thing that we can bring in, is interesting, because really a lot of it is how much will it cost, what are the trade-offs, what are people willing to live with, how will they change their behavior, what's real. There's an awful lot of pie-in-the-sky stuff promised that's never going to materialize by companies. How do you hold them accountable? And economics is a great way into all that story. I mean, tomorrow, I think today, it's probably published by now, but today and then at tomorrow's front page, our biggest, longest story is on how Ukraine has both, at the same time, stepped up the West's development and use of fossil fuels because they don't want Russia to do it, but also giving new energy to green initiatives to develop, because the urgency of getting away from fossil fuels feels greater. Both things are happening simultaneously. Economics is a great way into telling that story with some subtlety, I think.
Nice.
So I think we're doing better, but I think economic literacy on the whole topic could be higher for everybody.
Thank you.
I know class is going to be ending, so these will be our last 3 questions.
Raphael, third-year government major. Recently, in the past week, Amazon had its first warehouse unionized.
Yeah.
And you talked earlier about how business can be like a human story. Just from my perspective, I guess. why is it when we cover businesses that we talk so much about profit, and like the way the unionization has kind of been covered is like, well, this will affect Amazon's profit, but we don't talk as much about like, well, how is this going to affect the workers who are going to be unionized and represented?
I think business journalism often has a bias toward CEOs, companies, corporate events, and companies are very, very good at getting their messages and stories out that way. So I think what you're describing is not. I think a lot of business journalists would agree with you. I think getting those human stories, getting down on that level, can be harder work. I think there's a fair amount of both overall, but I think we could do better always on that human front and on getting into the situation for workers in lots of different places. Also, it's hard to get to workers sometimes. Companies are pretty tight and controlling sometimes about doing it. You have to be a more intrepid reporter sometimes for people to get in there, candidly. But I think it's one of the important things to do. I think very often in bad business journalism, and occasionally we do some of this too, unfortunately, because we can always do better, business journalism becomes about the CEO and the company alone and not about all the stakeholders. And employees are among the biggest stakeholders. So, I do think the interesting thing in the Amazon thing will be, is it one facility or is it going to spread? Because it's still a tiny percentage, a tiny share of the workforce. And so it might be a gigantic thing and it might be a one-off, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes from here. But candidly, keeping those things in balance and getting all the stakeholders is a constant challenge for a good reporter.
Matt, thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk to the students a little more. Sorry, Andrew Butters, assistant professor.
You were an associate professor.
That's right. Sorry.
Always double-check titles, including your own.
Kathleen just promoted me right there. So I was just wondering if you could talk to the students a little more about pathways into business journalism. I got my start in journalism at Bloomberg News, and I just thought I learned some incredible tools for looking at the world, as you were saying. And yet I find myself not talking to my students enough about business journalism. And so, what kinds of things should they study? Is Dow Jones still a good pathway into the Wall Street Journal? Just anything you could share.
I mean, I think to take business classes, economics classes, history classes is always one of the good things to do. And I think trade publications, Dow Jones, Bloomberg, they're all good places to get into. I would love to say go to your local paper and do business there, but many of them are doing much less business than they used to do, unfortunately, but there might still be opportunities there as well. And don't shy away from the business beat. We still hire, Dow Jones is the newswires part of the Wall Street Journal, and we still do hire people and bring them in that way, and they go on to the Wall Street Journal sometimes. Bloomberg hires a lot of people, and I don't even know all the other pathways at this point in time, the startups and the places to get in. There's still something of an ecosystem of things that might sound incredibly boring. Like one of the places people used to come in was working in bond buyer. And I don't know if bond buyer is still around, but it's a great thing to learn about.
Don't look at
bonds.
me
Yeah,
on the bond buyer.
So I think if you're interested in business, look for those opportunities too.
We are teaching a business journalism course. It's going to be really interesting with some accounting in there too. So you can really get an idea of what business journalism could be. And our last question.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I'm Grace Terrell, third-year biology major, and my question was kind of reflecting on the stories that you talked about that moved you to get into journalism and how you encourage reporters to kind of man that line between putting a human face on a real issue versus not crossing someone's privacy or monopolizing on their pain.
It's a really difficult, ongoing ethical conundrum in some ways at its most profound. And I have to say, and there's a great book about this by Janet Malcolm, who wrote all about this. There's a little, when you're a journalist and you're really writing a personal human story about people, there's always a little bit in which you're betraying them a little bit because you're asking them to open up their lives and their hearts and all the details to you, and you're you might be interested in them, but you're writing a story for people, and it can sometimes really feel exploitative. So it's something you have to live with. I don't have a good answer on it, except to say, I think it matters a lot how you handle yourself, how you talk to people, and what you share with them about how you're going to handle their material, and it matters a lot the sensitivity with which you handle it, as well as how you calibrate the way that you treat people in different strata of life. You know, if a CEO says something to you that's shocking, and then 10 minutes later the CEO goes, oh, by the way, that was off the record. No, it wasn't, because you know better, because you're a CEO, and you didn't say off the record. If, you know, an ordinary person in a situation like that does something like that, it's more complicated. And I don't want to, you know, pull punches, but the negotiation of that is part of the difficulty of doing those stories, I think. Some people are really brilliant at it, so.
I just found out there is a class that needs this room, but right before we go, I want to thank you so much.
Thank
You
you.
are invited to come back here this time next year for ISOJ, and there's just a bag of goodies.
Well,
thank you all. Let's
Thank you
give
all
them a
very
hand.
much, and thanks for the day.